A farmer is found shot to death in what appears to be a planned hit.
I didn't know the smell of gunpowder in your house, and that's a smell I will never forget.
He had extensive trauma to the left and middle of his face.
There was a perfect angle from the front porch down to the couch in the basement. We also found tracks around the house. It truly was as much of a hit as I have ever seen.
But in this small Midwest town, anyone could be the wolf in sheep's clothing.
The only person I know that I would think is capable is my ex.
Did you have anything to do with the murder?
Hell no. I got better things to do.
The investigation reveals a toxic family dynamic and the measures one person would take to conceal their misdeeds.
He had been threatening to turn them in for welfare fraud. 2 days before the homicide, he was texting, "I promise you, he will not make it till Monday morning."
I never thought in a million years he'd actually do it.
I stood up and sat on the door for a little bit, so I just lifted, shut my eyes, and let it fly.
March 10th, 2014. It's just after midnight in Barron, Wisconsin, when police receive an urgent 911 call.
Tiffany Workman called 911 reporting her boyfriend, Daniel Raven, had injuries to his shoulder.
He's got a hole in his arm, and I can't get him to wake up.
Your boyfriend has a hole in his arm?
Yes.
I remember talking to the emergency lady, and she said, "Does he have a heartbeat?" And I remember putting my cheek on his forehead, and I couldn't feel anything. I said he was still warm.
He's hurry. I don't know if he's sleeping, he's passed out. Oh my God. I don't know how this happened.
Our dispatchers immediately sent an ambulance, but also officers, because the caller was very hysterical at the time.
Tiffany tells the deputy she and Dan had an argument that night, so he'd gone to sleep on the couch in their game room. A short while later, she was awakened by a loud noise.
I remember hearing a slam, and I walked out, and the glass on the screen door was broke. I said, "Why is there blood everywhere?"
She went downstairs and saw Mr. Raven on the couch, and when she approached him, she could see that there was definitely something wrong with him.
I'm not a hunter. I didn't know the smell of gunpowder in your house, and that's a smell I will never forget.
The deputy escorts EMTs inside, where they find a bloody scene.
The first responder determined immediately that Dan Raven was deceased. It was obvious that he had extensive trauma to his upper left bicep, and there were also significant injuries to his face.
Several more deputies are dispatched to secure the area. On the ground outside the broken glass doors, they find 2 empty shell casings.
The spent rounds were obviously from a long rifle versus a pistol or a shotgun.
We knew with the casings outside and the victim downstairs, it was going to be a homicide investigation.
I didn't realize that he was actually dead. I didn't know. I was under the impression that you guys are here to help him. You're gonna get him out of here, and you're gonna save him, and he's gonna be fine.
Daniel Raven had lived nearly his entire life in rural Wisconsin. He was born February 16th, 1981, the youngest of 3 children raised on a dairy farm.
We were all close. We had lots of friends, lots of family. We spent many hours in our barn, just working, playing. We'd go camping, we'd go fishing, we'd play out in the pasture. We lived on a farm, so you made up your own fun.
Dan's dad was a hard worker. He instilled that in Dan because Dan was an extremely hard worker as well.
Dan's first job, I believe he was a sophomore in high school, and he worked as a dairy's aide. Basically milking, milking cows.
Between work and his studies, Dan was extremely busy. But he made time for a beautiful young woman named Trista Hrabak. Like Dan, she'd grown up in the area in a close-knit family.
Trista was in our social circle in high school, and that's how we all kind of started hanging out together. They eventually started dating. They would go hiking and four-wheeling, and they loved to be together. She just had a way about her. She could get anything she wanted.
A few years later, Trista announced that she was pregnant.
He was surprised and very happy. His daughter was actually born a couple months before my oldest daughter.
And a couple years later, then come little boy, and Dan was happy. He was very happy.
After 7 years together and 2 children, Dan and Trista decided to make it official in 2005.
When I heard they were getting married, I went up to Dan and asked him, "Are you sure?" From what Dan told me, they fought quite a bit and argued, and he said, "Yeah, I wanted to start a family, but he already had kids with her."
Dan loved his kids. He would take them hunting and fishing and tried to spend as much time as he could with them.
A few years later, Dan and Trista embarked on a new venture together, running a cafe within the local livestock auction building.
It was the restaurant's Bullwhip Cafe at the sales barn in Barron, Wisconsin.
I believe they got it from her parents, or her mother had ran it, and they did good there for a while.
Now in their early 30s, the stress of running a restaurant and raising a family took a toll on Dan and Trista's marriage.
There were many times he would call upset, or I could tell he was upset because he'd struggle. Most married people do. They all have their problems, but the more he tried, the more difficult everything became. It wasn't working.
Them fighting, not seeing each other, making amends, getting back together, it was just a cycle off and on. I thought that was the final straw, and Dan would finally be like, this woman doesn't love me.
He wasn't happy. And then he moved out. He got his own place.
After 8 years as a married couple, Dan and Trista divorced in 2013. They shared custody of their children, but Dan was saddened by the limited time he got to spend with them.
Dan managed the turkey barns. He was up from sunup to sundown. That farm was all he ever did. He didn't get a chance to do a whole lot because he was always at the farm.
He went through a period of depression. Then he went through a period of, drinking kind of heavily towards the end of it. But he was sad about the whole thing.
Dan's life seemed to take a turn for the better when he met Tiffany Workman.
I met Dan through work. We kind of built a friendship through there. He kind of grew up in a kind of a similar farm background life. We just kind of hit it off.
When he met Tiffany, it was nice to see him feeling good and, just being happy with life.
Like Dan, Tiffany was divorced with 2 children of her own. They moved into a house together on the farm where they worked.
He was always equal with my kids, just the same as he was with his. And I think that was amazing. We kind of blended really well.
She was doing wonders on him because he was so happy, and I don't know, he just seemed to be back in his groove. The storm was over.
But Tiffany has just found Dan shot to death, and detectives are analyzing the scene to determine what happened.
There was a perfect angle from the front porch that you could see down to the couch in the basement. Somebody walked up to the outside of the door, did not attempt to make entry, fired 2 rounds through the door, making what would be perfect shots at a victim lying defenseless. We also found tracks leading up from the roadway and around the house where the person appeared to be trying to observe the residents before moving into position and making the shots. It also showed us that the person parked out on the roadway and walked up along a tree line to conceal their identity.
After inspection of the house, it was our belief there was some sort of connection between the shooter and the victim.
It wasn't random. It truly was as much of a hit as I have ever seen. Tiffany was the first one on scene, the only one awake in the residence.
They bring Tiffany to the station for further questioning.
They started asking me all quite questions like, what happened? What did you do? And it's like, what did I do? I didn't even know what was going on.
I informed her that Dan was, in fact, deceased, where she began sobbing and crying and became very emotional. And it was quite apparent she was not aware that he had passed away.
I just wish this was a dream.
Sometimes people can be pretty good actors, but in her case, she was really distraught. And based on her reaction to what happened, it really didn't seem like she was the person who was involved or had anything to do with it. But you never really know.
Coming up, police question Tiffany about the events leading up to Dan's murder.
Who do you think is capable of this?
And evidence surfaces of a scheme at play.
Shortly before he got killed, Dan showed me a stack of papers about this thick that he had on her.
The Barron County Sheriff's Department is investigating the murder of 33-year-old turkey farmer Daniel Raven. With his girlfriend Tiffany ruled out as a suspect, they hope she can offer further leads. They ask her to describe what happened the evening before the shooting.
Tiffany said on Sunday evening, around 6:30, 7 p.m., she had picked up her 2 children from her ex-husband who had visitation over the weekend. When she came back to the residence, Daniel was downstairs watching television.
He had a few drinks. We'd had an argument earlier that day, which was wild because we never argued before. And I remember thinking, this is just weird, like something weird is going on. And he's like, I'm not coming down yet.
She reported that was the last time she seen him alive.
The evidence appears to support Tiffany's claims.
We could not find a gun in the residence, nor were there tracks that would indicate it may have been taken somewhere and dumped. If it wasn't her, who could it be? What has been going on?
Who do you think is capable, of this?
The only person I know that I would think is capable is my ex.
Him and I had a lot of rough patches, I guess would be the best way to say it. We had domestic issues. I was scared of him.
She stated that he was working typically out of state, and stated that he had been in Barron County on the weekend of this homicide.
But Tiffany says she isn't the only one who has a disgruntled ex.
I know he's been having a lot of problems with his ex. There's always some drama going on with those two.
And who is that?
Trista Hrabak.
She described the contentious divorce and child support hearings between Dan Raven and Trista Hrabak.
November of 2013, his attorney had sent a letter, court hearing, to requesting a change in support because Dan was paying, I think, $256 a month and wanted it reduced because Trista had been making more money than she reported.
The plan was he was supposed to go to court with Trista that week, and they were going to bring that all forward because he had talked to a lawyer. He had everything all lined up.
And that was upsetting Trista.
When Dan had brought Trista to court, he had told me, Tiff, if anything ever happens, it's her. It's Trista.
Following the interview, police find plenty of evidence to back up Tiffany's claims.
Dan and Trista had a lot of ongoing small complaints about each other, violations of the child custody, and contacting each other in a negative sense.
He had custody, 50-50 custody of the kids with Trista. He also paid child support.
But Dan claimed Trista went to extreme lengths to get more.
Dan had told me she was falsifying records to make it look like she wasn't making any income to continue to try to bleed him as much as she could.
Shortly before he got killed, Dan came up and showed me a stack of papers about this thick that he had on her. Food stamps, lying on taxes.
He was accusing her of underreporting and non-reporting income to the court, which forced Dan Raven to get an attorney and hold more hearings.
Daniel was killed before the issue could go to court, and Trista was never charged with any crime. Daniel's loved ones are devastated to learn of his death, and they all agree with Tiffany.
Everyone consistently kept mentioning Trista's name and Trista having something to do with this crime.
But before speaking with Trista, detectives first want to rule out Tiffany's ex-husband.
Tiffany's ex told us that he had the kids on the day prior to the homicide, and he had dropped the kids off with Tiffany in the afternoon, and then from there, just out drinking. Maybe around 2:30 in the morning, he turned in for the night.
He was adamant that he had no involvement.
We then followed up with all the names and establishments that the ex-husband provided, and all of the leads that he gave us panned out for him.
Tiffany's ex is officially ruled out, and of their 3 possible suspects, detectives are now left with 1.
What Tiffany said and the history that officers already knew, we definitely believed we knew we had to look at Trista very closely.
Before approaching Trista Hrabak about her conflict with Dan Raven over child support, investigators speak with his family to learn more about their history.
Dan had called me up, and he was cleaning out his blazer, and he found a sawed-off shotgun under the seat that he believes, and I believe, that she planted there to try to get him into trouble.
Dan had a felony in his past, so he would get caught for felon in possession of a firearm, which could have easily sent him to prison for 2 years.
The incident wasn't reported formally, so no charges were pressed against Trista. However, Dan had responded by threatening to turn Trista in for what he claimed was criminal fraud regarding the misapplication of food stamps.
He told me she was using food stamps, Wisconsin food stamps, to pay for food for the restaurant after they had broken up. And that's the only way she could afford to keep the restaurant going.
Daniel claimed Trista had not been reporting that income.
I think a lot of it was just empty threats about turning her in for that stuff. It was just kind of his way to kind of get back at her.
Detectives soon receive a new lead.
The Barron County Sheriff's Department was contacted by a caseworker from the Department of Health and Human Services. She told the communications center that she had important information that might be relevant to the case.
The social worker says she was asked to interview Trista Hrabak and her new live-in boyfriend, Ian Shirley, after a complaint filed by Ian's ex-wife.
I had made a report against Ian and Trista shortly before everything happened, just from things that my girls were saying. Trista kind of ignored them when they were there, like acted like they didn't exist. I know that the girls had to sleep on the floor.
I was happy for my dad at first because he was really hung up on my mom for a long time afterwards, so I was glad he was kind of moving on. Later on, she started to, really show that she didn't really like me and my sister.
Trista is very manipulative because your feelings aren't important to her, really. It's her way or no way.
She would try to hit my dad. He wasn't allowed to defend himself. She would come wake us up in the middle of the night and drag us into their fights.
It seems Ian and Trista's fights were about her ex-husband, Dan. And during the interviews, Ian said something alarming.
As she was interviewing Ian Shirley about his actions living with Trista Hrabak, Shirley made an offhanded comment that the quickest and easiest way to end this conflict is to kill Dan Raven.
Armed with this new information, detectives subpoena phone records for both Ian and Trista. While the request is being processed, investigators track down the couple at a local restaurant 2 days after the shooting. They pull Ian outside to question him.
How did you guys get along with either Tiffany or Dan?
The only time I ever talked to Dan was the very first time I ever met Trista.
Okay.
A little more than 2 years ago.
Do you have anything to do with the murder of Dan Raven?
Hell no. I have better things to do.
Ian claims he and Trista were out together the night Dan was killed.
Of March 9th, he and Trista had went to a local bar. He said at what I recall to be 8:30, 9 p.m. at night, they were planning on traveling to rural New Auburn, which is approximately 20 miles away.
We were going to go there to get something to eat. And we just about got there and realized they stopped serving at 9. So we turned around and went home. Got home quarter after 10.
He told us if we checked their cameras, we could see that he had not left the residence.
Ian also told us that he had only learned of Dan Raven's death at approximately 6 a.m. the next morning, when he said his phone blew up by everybody asking what happened.
After speaking with Ian in the parking lot, we went inside the cafe and met with Trista in the back.
Who all went out? Just the two of you?
Just me and him. We ran into a bunch of people.
And then you go home? Yeah. And then what?
Well, we stayed up talking for a while. That was good.
Trista downplays any recent tension between herself and Dan.
When we first separated, it wasn't good. I mean, we were at each other like a lot. We got along after all that.
When asked directly if she was involved with Dan's death, she indicated there was no way that she would be responsible.
But detectives aren't convinced.
The story was too rehearsed. If the story wasn't as rehearsed, it would have made it more believable, which did not take them off the suspect list. It actually pushed them higher.
What should happen, the person we eventually caught, because they wrote the car.
I think they should have used death approach. I think they should go down the same way you did.
However, investigators need more to be able to press any charges.
We didn't have the physical evidence to tie Trista in without a confession at this time. We needed more. So when the cell phone records came in, detectives immediately started combing through them.
We noticed immediately text messages between Trista Hrabak and Ian Shirley that were relevant to this case.
They were chilling. It was something I had never seen before.
Coming up, a murder plot unfolds.
The persuasion, threats, violence, it was all spelled out.
And one of the co-conspirators decides to come clean.
Well, there ain't no help. I'm screwed.
Within 48 hours of Dan Raven's murder, Barron County detectives have uncovered cell phone records implicating his ex-wife Trista Hrabak and her boyfriend Ian Shirley.
The text records indicated that there had been multiple previous attempts where Ian had went to the turkey farm to murder Dan Raven, but had backed out.
With every failed attempt, Trista turned up the heat.
She was very upset to the point where she was threatening to leave him if he didn't go through with killing Dan Raven.
2 days before the homicide, Ian was texting Trista saying, "I promise you, he will not make it till Monday morning." And Trista replied by saying, "Don't make me promises you can't keep." The persuasion, threats, violence, it was all spelled out in text messages that I've never seen before.
The texts are chilling, but they also reveal another co-conspirator.
While we're analyzing the text messages, we identify a third suspect, what we presume to be a driver.
The text message said, "Tell RB that we'll give him an extra $100 if we can get this done tonight." Ian had received a text message from RB at approximately 10:54 p.m. the night of the murder that he was on his way. Less than an hour and a half after this text message is received, Daniel is dead.
We take steps to try and identify who he is through his phone number. Ultimately, he's identified as Robert McBain.
With no apparent connection to the current suspects, investigators track him down.
Detectives went and located him at his place of work in the village of Cameron in Barron County.
And initially, Robert McBain denies being involved in the homicide, but, you know, we're holding some pretty good cards with the text messages. And so we start revealing some of that information to basically indicate that he's lying. So he starts to give a little bit more information back.
He stated that he was friends with Ian Shirley and Trista Hrabak. He described how they would hang out together and have a few beers and drinks after work and on the weekends. He recalled Ian commenting several times while they were drinking that they wished Dan was dead.
We made jokes about it, but that's about it.
What do you mean you make jokes about it?
Who doesn't want to, make jokes about the popular ex?
Robert says he didn't think they were serious, but eventually agreed to act as Ian's driver.
He stated that he had actually went with Ian Shirley on at least 6 previous attempts to the turkey farm with intent to kill Dan Raven. He said typically Ian would back out.
But the night of March 10th, when Ian got out of the car, Robert says he looked determined.
What did Ian do when you let him out there?
Went up the driveway.
Okay. What did he have with him? What kind of gun?
Looked like an outsider.
He admitted to hearing 2 gunshots.
I was like, what the hell?
Because now you realize he did it.
Yeah. I was like, holy.
I never thought in a million years he'd actually do it.
After the shooting, he had followed Ian's directions where they stopped at a nearby bridge and had hid and concealed the rifle used in this murder.
McBain told the story, very believably, about hiding the murder weapon underneath a bridge, which detectives later found.
How much did you get paid, and who paid you? No bull aside.
No bull aside.
Ian gave me about 120. Were you supposed to get more after it was done?
Yeah.
How much?
Wasn't it something like 500?
At the end of the interview, McBain was arrested and taken to the Barron County Jail for party to a crime of homicide. After McBain basically verified what we knew, but was able to put himself at the scene, and not just himself, but Ian Shirley as the man who truly pulled the trigger, it was then time to go back and meet with Ian Shirley again.
After damning text messages and a confession from the getaway driver, detectives confront Ian Shirley about killing Dan Raven.
He knew he was done. He knew that he was caught.
You got to understand that for us to be able to help you, you got to be straight up with us.
Okay. Well, there ain't no help. Yeah, I did. I'm screwed.
Ian says Trista was desperate to get rid of Dan.
Ian told us Dan had been threatening to turn them in for food stamp and welfare fraud, and Trista was afraid she was going to go to federal prison.
So if Dan is out of the picture, that stuff stops, is what you're saying? His court case is dropped.
He described several different times of McBain driving him to the residence, getting dropped off, but never actually pulled the trigger.
And go back home with some piss poor excuse of why I couldn't do it or whatever, because I didn't want to.
But Ian says Trista didn't give him much choice.
It was either that or she committed suicide. She jumped all over me and said, yeah, you know, if it ain't done by tomorrow morning, I ain't going to work, and by the time you get done, I won't be here.
It was kill Dan or lose her, and he didn't want to lose her.
According to Ian, March 10th would be his last chance to get the job done. Trista knew her children wouldn't be there, so he didn't have to worry about them.
He took a .30-06 rifle with open sights, and they drove to the turkey farm.
Shirley goes to the residence and sees Raven sitting on a couch in the lower level.
And I'm still weighing options on what the hell do I do. And, well, I actually pulled the trigger and it jammed.
Ian says he went back to the car, but knew he couldn't fail Trista again.
This was his chance to say it didn't work. But they went down the road. He cleared what appeared to be a jam, got the rifle ready to go, and had McBain drive him back.
After I reloaded and I went back up there, I stood out the side of the door for a little bit. And I didn't know what to do there. So I just lifted, shut my eyes, and let it fly.
He was unsure of where he struck Daniel or if he struck Daniel because of how nervous he was.
As they drove away, Ian says Trista texted them updates as she listened to a police scanner.
So she basically knew based off the scanner that he was deceased.
Yeah. Well, that's hoping I didn't.
He said once back at his house, he went through the woods and walked in this rear door that was out of view of the cameras. He said that the surveillance cameras that he and Trista had installed were actually a ruse. He said they planned the installation and this walkway being out of view as part of their ruse so that it would support their alibi as to being home. After hearing Ian's confession, he matched the crime scene. Caliber of the rifle recovered and the 2 bullet casings matched. It matched footprints that originally we noticed in the snow along the edge of the driveway and where a vehicle had parked on the roadway alongside the driveway. He was placed under arrest and subsequently charged with first-degree intentional homicide of Dan Raven. After the full confessions of Robert McBain and Ian Shirley, Trista Hrabak was arrested and transported to the Barron County Jail.
There's no way I can say bye to her first. She's already being processed.
Trista Hrabak was also charged with first-degree intentional homicide of Dan Raven as party to the crime.
Trista's initial response to officers when being arrested was, "Why am I being arrested? I didn't do anything."
But even with confessions from her co-conspirators, prosecutors know holding Trista accountable could be an uphill battle.
Trista had invoked her right to an attorney and had not confessed.
She believes because she didn't.
Following their confessions, Ian Shirley and Robert McBain plead guilty to second-degree intentional homicide. Ian is sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Robert receives 15 years.
As we continued to interview the outlying people that were involved, from bar patrons to friends to family, the most consistent word I think I heard in interviews was evil. And that's a word that people use to describe Trista, was evil.
Ian's family provides some scathing testimony.
She was behind this. You know, Ian pulled the trigger, and he needs to be in trouble for that, but this was not his idea. Never.
Before I even knew who Dan was. And her kids knew it too, that she hated their dad. She was pretty manipulative.
She had just changed who he was as a person. Anyone who knows him knows that he would have never done something like this.
He had moved out of his house. He had sold everything that he owned and pretty much gave himself to Trista. It had gotten bad to where I don't think he seen much of a way out, you know.
I've heard her threaten suicide a few times during their fights. I think that's another manipulation tactic, too.
Both Ian Shirley and Robert McBain were easily manipulated. Ian had described Dan Raven as being a nice guy, but was aware that Trista did not like him and wanted him out of the picture. Robert McBain said he had never even met Dan Raven personally, but simply knew of Trista Hrabak's hatred toward him. It was apparent that Trista Hrabak was actually the mastermind.
But without any direct evidence of Trista's involvement, prosecutors are worried she might be exonerated. So, they make a difficult decision.
There are always fears of taking your case to a jury trial, especially since Trista had not confessed and was blaming Ian for his actions and McMahon just going along with it.
Trista's attorneys seem equally concerned about risking a jury trial, so they accept a plea deal.
In February of 2015, Trista was sentenced to 15 years of initial confinement with 10 years on extended supervision.
When I heard my dad's sentence, I wasn't surprised by 20 years, but I think Trista should have gotten at least the same as my dad, at minimum.
The fact that you can plan, and I can say that, plan a murder like that and get people involved, not just once, but to try it multiple times, and then you get 15 years in jail? I mean, what kind of joke is that?
I don't think any sentence would have been fair enough for me, honestly. It's not for me to judge. It's not really even a judge to judge, but I don't think it was fair.
Every year, me and, my cousins, my friends, we get together, we have a guys' camping weekend where Dan's ashes are spread, and just hang out with Dan, and talk about old times.
There's a memorial out there for Dan, and we go out there every year camping just to kind of spend time with them.
I feel like Dan's been there for me a few times, and I try to live as best as I can for him. I feel like he's watching over me still.
I just want him to be remembered for not the hard times that him and Trista.
Texas 1998 cold case solved. Arrest shocks quiet town. At 2:17 in the morning, the town of Bellwether, Texas, was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The other kind. The kind that makes every distant sound seem closer than it really is. A dog barked somewhere beyond Willow Street. A truck rolled along the highway several miles away. The old courthouse clock had stopped working months earlier, so there was no chime to mark the hour. Only darkness. Only heat. Only the faint movement of curtains behind the windows of sleeping houses. Then, inside a small yellow house at the end of Willow Street, a telephone began to ring.
Once. Twice.
3 times. 23-year-old Laura Bennett opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she reached for the receiver. Hello. No answer. Laura waited. She could hear something on the other end. A faint mechanical sound. A low hum. Then what sounded like a car door closing. Hello. Still nothing. 19 seconds later, the line went dead. Laura placed the receiver back on the hook. She never knew that those 19 seconds would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a mystery that would survive for almost 3 decades. By sunrise, Laura Bennett would be gone. Her car would still be outside. Her purse would still be inside. Her keys would still be sitting on the kitchen counter. And the bedroom window would be standing open to the August night. There would be no broken lock.
No overturned furniture.
No blood. No note.
No obvious explanation.
Just an empty house. And a woman who seemed to have vanished between one telephone call and the rising Texas sun. Bellwether was not the kind of place where people disappeared. The town sat beneath a wide Texas sky, surrounded by dry fields, ranch roads, and long stretches of highway where headlights could be seen from miles away. The population was barely 9,000. There was one courthouse, one high school, 2 gas stations, a diner that opened before dawn and closed before midnight. Everyone knew everyone. People knew which truck belonged to which rancher. They knew who had gotten divorced,
who had lost money,
who had been arrested, who was getting married. And when Laura Bennett disappeared, the entire town knew before the first day was over. Laura had grown up there. She was not reckless. She did not disappear for days. She did not leave without telling her mother. She worked at the Bellwether County Credit Union. She arrived on time. She went home after work. She called her mother every Sunday evening. She had plans. She had friends. She had a normal life. That was why the first explanation sounded impossible. Maybe she had simply left. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she had driven away. But her car was still there. Her wallet was still there. Her driver's license was still in her purse. And her favorite pair of shoes were beside her bed. At 6:40 that morning, Laura's mother, Elaine Bennett, arrived at the house. She had expected to find her daughter asleep. Instead, she found the front door unlocked. The kitchen light was on. A glass of water sat beside the sink. Half full. Still cold. Elaine called Laura's name. Nothing. She checked the bathroom. Nothing. The bedroom. Empty. Then she noticed the window. Open. The curtains moved slowly in the warm morning air. Elaine later told investigators that she knew immediately something was wrong. Not because of the open window. Because Laura never left it open. Never. Elaine called the sheriff's office. 14 minutes later, Deputy Mark Harlan arrived. He walked through the house carefully. He checked the doors, the windows, the closets, the garage, the backyard. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no obvious struggle.
No damit furniture.
No broken glass. Nothing that looked like a crime scene. And yet, one fact was impossible to ignore. Laura Bennett was gone. At 9:15 that morning, she was officially reported missing. By noon, volunteers were searching the surrounding fields. By sunset, more than 100 people had joined the search. Farmers brought trucks. Hunters brought dogs. Firefighters brought flashlights. Neighbors walked through drainage ditches and empty lots. They called Laura's name until their voices became hoarse. But the fields gave them nothing. The highway gave them nothing. The river gave them nothing. The first real clue came from a truck driver named Roy Maddox. Maddox told investigators that he had driven past Willow Street around 2:30 that morning. He remembered seeing a dark sedan parked near Laura's house. The vehicle was facing away from the street. He could not identify the make. He could not identify the driver. But he remembered one strange detail. There was no front license plate. Investigators immediately checked the description. Texas vehicles were required to display front plates. That should have made the car easier to identify. Instead, the clue created another mystery. Nobody else had seen it. Not the neighbors. Not the patrol officer. Not the newspaper delivery driver. Not the person who drove down Willow Street shortly before dawn. Only Roy Maddox remembered the vehicle. And even he admitted that the darkness made identification difficult. Then another witness came forward. A waitress at the Bellwether Diner remembered seeing Laura the previous evening. Around 10:15 p.m. Laura had been alone.
She ordered coffee.
She sat near the window. She barely touched the drink. According to the waitress, Laura kept looking toward the parking lot.
Once. Twice.
Then a third time. What was she looking at? Investigators asked. The waitress didn't know. There had been cars outside. Headlights. Customers coming and going. Nothing obviously suspicious. But the memory stayed with her. Laura had looked nervous. Not terrified. Just distracted. As if she were waiting for someone. Or afraid someone might arrive. Investigators searched the diner parking lot. They found nothing.
No fingerprints.
No note. No witness who could confirm seeing Laura with anyone. The investigation was already beginning to split into possibilities. Was Laura abducted? Did she leave voluntarily? Was someone she knew involved? Was the open window a clue? Or was it simply a window? Every question produced another question. 3 days later, detectives found something in the kitchen. A faint muddy footprint near the back door. Size 11. Possibly a man's. The print was incomplete. The soil had been tracked across a small section of the floor. Investigators photographed it. They collected samples. But the footprint was never preserved as evidence in the way modern investigators might have preserved it. The floor was cleaned. The photograph was filed. And the case moved forward. Then, 11 days after Laura disappeared, something was found 2 miles from Willow Street. A teenage boy named Eric Malloy was riding his bicycle along an abandoned drainage road when he noticed something shining beneath a pile of weeds.
He stopped,
reached down, and pulled out a silver bracelet. It was scratched.
Dirty,
but recognizable. Laura's mother identified it that same afternoon. It belonged to Laura. The discovery changed the investigation. Laura had been there. Or someone had taken the bracelet there. Either possibility was disturbing. The drainage ditch was searched immediately. Officers dug through mud. They examined the surrounding fields. They searched the nearby road. Nothing else was found.
no clothing, no weapon,
No body. No footprints that could be connected to the original scene. Just the bracelet. A tiny object that suddenly became the center of the case. The town began to panic. Parents stopped letting their children walk home alone. Women carried keys between their fingers when crossing parking lots. The diner began closing earlier. People watched unfamiliar vehicles. Every dark sedan became suspicious. Every stranger became a potential suspect. Then a name began circulating. Daniel Cross. 29 years old. A local contractor.
divorced,
Well known around Bellwether. Cross had dated Laura several months earlier. The relationship had ended badly. There had been arguments. There had been angry telephone calls. There had even been a confrontation at the credit union, according to one coworker. Cross denied harming Laura. He admitted knowing her. He admitted they had dated. But he insisted he had not seen her on the night she disappeared. His alibi was simple. He claimed he had been working late at a construction site outside town. Investigators checked.
the site existed.
Cross had worked there. But nobody could independently confirm that he had remained there all night. That made him interesting. It did not make him guilty. Police searched his truck. Nothing. They searched his house. Nothing. They questioned his former wife. Nothing. Without a body, without a weapon, and without a witness, there was no arrest. Daniel Cross remained free. And Laura Bennett remained missing. Weeks became months. The search parties disappeared. The reporters left. The television cameras moved on to other stories. The posters on telephone poles began to fade beneath the Texas sun. But Elaine Bennett refused to stop looking. Every Sunday, she still set 2 plates on the table. One for herself. One for Laura. She kept Laura's bedroom exactly as it had been. The clothes remained in the closet. The books remained on the shelf. The photograph beside the mirror never moved. People told Elaine that she had to accept reality. She refused. Because there was one thing she could not accept. That her daughter had simply vanished. Years passed. 1999. 2000.
2001. The sheriff changed. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. Some died. Some forgot. And the case was eventually placed inside a cardboard box at the Bellwether Sheriff's Office. The label was simple: Bennett Laura, missing person / suspicious circumstances. For years, nobody opened it. Then, almost a decade later, a retired detective did. He had never forgotten the photograph of the muddy footprint. He studied it again. The image was grainy. The print was incomplete. But there was something unusual along the edge. 3 narrow diagonal marks. A broken rectangular pattern. À taille mi-circulaire impression.
At the time, nobody had known what it meant. In 1998, there had been no reason to believe that a footprint could survive long enough to solve a murder. But technology had changed. Databases had changed. DNA analysis had changed. And evidence that once seemed useless could now speak. The detective placed the photograph back on the desk. He stared at it. Then at the old case file. Then at Laura's photograph. 28 years would pass before anyone could prove what happened that night. But the answer was already hiding inside the evidence. The dark sedan. The 19-second telephone call. The muddy footprint. The silver bracelet. And the man who said he had never seen Laura that night. Bellwether thought the case was dead. It wasn't. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to look again. And when they finally did, the quiet town would discover that the person responsible for Laura Bennett's disappearance had been much closer than anyone wanted to believe. For 28 years, the file remained closed. Not officially. The Bellwether Sheriff's Office never declared the case solved, never declared Laura Bennett dead, and never stopped accepting information. But there is a difference between an open file and an active investigation. By the early 2000s, Laura's disappearance had become one of those cases people spoke about in lowered voices. A name on an old missing person poster. A photograph that had faded beneath the Texas sun. A story older residents remembered while younger people barely knew the details. But Elaine Bennett remembered every detail. She remembered the telephone. She remembered the open window. She remembered the glass of water on the kitchen counter. And most of all, she remembered the keys. Laura's keys had been sitting exactly where she had left them. That meant Laura had not planned to drive away. At least, that was what Elaine believed. For years, she returned to that small fact whenever someone suggested Laura might have simply disappeared. She wouldn't leave without her keys, Elaine would say. The sentence became almost a family prayer. She wouldn't leave without her keys. She wouldn't leave her car. She wouldn't leave her purse. She wouldn't leave her mother without saying goodbye. And she certainly would not leave behind everything she had built. But police needed more than certainty. They needed evidence. And in 1998, the evidence was disappearing almost as quickly as the trail. The original telephone records were incomplete. The muddy footprint had been photographed but never properly preserved. The dark sedan had never been identified. The bracelet had been recovered from an open drainage ditch, exposed to weather and contamination. And the witnesses were relying on memories that became less reliable with every passing year. Still, one detective refused to let the case disappear completely. His name was Thomas Reed. He had been one of the investigators assigned to Laura's disappearance during the first week. By 2004, Reed had retired. He lived alone outside Bellwether in a small house surrounded by mesquite trees. He no longer carried a badge. But he still carried the case. One rainy afternoon, Reed opened the old cardboard box containing Laura's file. He spread the photographs across his dining room table. Laura's bedroom. The open window. The kitchen. The back door. The muddy footprint. The drainage ditch. The silver bracelet. And finally,
A photograph of Daniel Cross. Reed stared at it for a long time. Cross had always bothered him. Not because of anything dramatic. Because of what was missing. His alibi had never been solid. His relationship with Laura had ended badly. He had been one of the last people connected to her who could not be independently placed that night. But there had never been enough. No body.
No weapon.
No blood.
No confession.
Nothing that could survive a courtroom. Reed picked up the photograph of the footprint. He studied it again. The print looked almost meaningless. Then he noticed the heel. 3 diagonal lines. A broken rectangle. A circular mark. Reed wrote down the pattern. He had no idea what it meant. But he knew one thing. A footprint was not just a footprint. It was a record of where someone had stood. And whoever had stood behind Laura's house had left something behind. The problem was that the technology needed to understand it did not exist in Bellwether in 1998. So Reed called an old colleague. Then another. He began asking questions. What kind of boot had that tread? Which manufacturers sold it in Texas in 1998? How common was it? Could a specific model be identified? The answer came slowly. A possible match was found. Redline work boots. A model manufactured during the late 1990s. The tread pattern was distinctive. 3 diagonal grooves. A broken rectangular block. A small circular void near the heel. The investigator found an old catalog. The pattern was almost identical. But almost was not enough. Thousands of pairs had been sold. A work boot was not a fingerprint. It could belong to anyone. Still, Reed checked local businesses. One name appeared. Bellwether Construction Supply. The store had sold redline boots to local contractors throughout 1998. And one customer had purchased a pair in July. Daniel Cross. Size 11. The same size recorded in the original report. Reed sat silently after finding the receipt. It was a coincidence. It had to be treated as one. Cross was a construction worker. Of course, he owned work boots. Size 11 was common. A similar tread pattern was not proof of murder. Reed knew that. But he also knew investigators should never ignore a coincidence that points in the same direction as several others. He copied the receipt. Then he copied the boot catalog. Then he placed both documents inside Laura's file. For years, nothing happened. The case remained cold. Then came 2008. A new generation of investigators began reviewing old unsolved cases. Laura's file surfaced again. This time, investigators focused on the silver bracelet. It had been stored in an evidence envelope for almost a decade. Modern forensic testing offered something investigators in 1998 could only dream about. DNA. The bracelet was sent to a laboratory. Technicians examined the clasp. The metal surface was cleaned carefully. A partial biological profile was recovered.
Male.
The result was not a complete identification, but it was enough to establish something important. A man had handled the bracelet. The defense of the future would argue that this meant nothing. Laura had dated men. She had friends. She had coworkers. The bracelet could have been touched by anyone. And, because it had been found outdoors, contamination was possible. The profile was entered into a national database. No match. The unknown man remained unknown. Then investigators looked at Daniel Cross again. He was living in Oklahoma by then. He had remarried. He owned a successful construction company. He had children. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, reliable. The kind of man who fixed broken fences and helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. Nobody suspected him. When detectives contacted Cross, he agreed to speak with them. He appeared relaxed. They asked about Laura. He said it was tragic. They asked about their relationship. He said they had dated briefly. They asked when he had last seen her. Cross gave the same answer he had given in 1998. He had not seen her the night she disappeared. He had been working. He remembered being tired. He remembered going home afterward. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. The interview ended.
No arrest. No confession. No breakthrough.
But investigators noticed something. Cross had changed one detail from his original statement. In 1998, he had said he worked until approximately 3 in the morning. In the new interview, he said he left the construction site around midnight. That difference was small, but it mattered. Investigators went back to the old employment records. The construction site had actually closed at 11:30 p.m. Cross had been scheduled to work, but there was no evidence he remained there after the site closed. For the first time, his alibi was not simply weak. It was inconsistent. The investigation became active again. Detectives returned to Bellwether. They found the former construction supervisor.
He was elderly now.
His memory was damaged by time. But one thing he remembered clearly. Daniel Cross had a dark sedan. A Ford Taurus. And in the summer of 1998, the car did not display a front license plate. That detail matched Roy Maddox's description from the night Laura vanished. The investigators searched old vehicle records. The Taurus had belonged to Cross. Registered in his name. Sold 6 months after Laura disappeared. The buyer had died years earlier. The car itself was gone. But an old insurance photograph survived. It showed the vehicle from the front. No license plate. Same model. Same dark paint. The evidence was still circumstantial. But the pattern was getting darker. Then investigators found the gas station photograph. It had been discovered years earlier inside a rusted metal box beneath an old service road. At first, nobody understood why it mattered. The photograph showed a gas station. A date was written on the back. August 17, 1998. 3 days before Laura vanished. A dark sedan stood near the pumps. No front plate. The image was blurry. But investigators enlarged it. The vehicle appeared to have damage along the rear bumper. They compared it with the insurance photograph of Cross's Taurus. The damage matched. The photograph did not prove Cross was the driver, but it placed his vehicle in the area shortly before Laura vanished. Then investigators discovered something even stranger. The photograph had been taken less than 2 miles from Laura's house. Who took it? Why was it buried? And why was it inside a box containing old construction equipment? Those questions led investigators toward an abandoned service road. The road had once been used by construction crews. It passed behind the Bellwether supply yard. In 1998, Daniel Cross had access to the property. The records showed he had keys. He could enter after hours. He could drive equipment through the rear gate. And there was another detail. The rear gate used a hydraulic locking system, the kind that produced a distinctive metallic clicking sound. The same kind of sound heard faintly in the background of Laura's final telephone call. Investigators now had a possible explanation for the 19 seconds. Laura had answered the phone. She had heard something. A gate. A vehicle. A person nearby. Then the line went dead. But if Cross had called her, why would the call originate from a payphone? That question remained unanswered. Until investigators found an old telephone maintenance record. The payphone was located near the construction supply yard. It had been repaired 2 days before Laura vanished. The technician remembered seeing a dark sedan nearby. He remembered a man standing beside it.
He could not identify him.
But he remembered the vehicle. No front plate. The same detail again. At this point, investigators stopped asking whether the clues were connected. They started asking how. The answer still depended on Laura. What had she known? Why had she been nervous at the diner? Why had she looked toward the parking lot? Why had someone apparently called her at 2:17 in the morning? Why had her bracelet been found miles away? And why had a footprint matching boots purchased by Daniel Cross been left near her back door? Then investigators reopened Laura's employment records. She had worked at the county credit union. 3 days before her disappearance, she had accessed a file involving a construction company. Cross's company. The file contained irregular invoices. Payments that did not match the work performed. Numbers that did not make sense. Laura had flagged the documents. A co-worker remembered that she had been worried. She had said someone was hiding something. But she had never explained who. Investigators searched old correspondence. One handwritten note was found inside a personnel folder. The note had been written by Laura. Only one sentence was visible. If anything happens, check the Cross file. The room went silent. For 28 years, investigators had searched for a reason. Now they had one. Laura may have discovered financial fraud. She may have confronted Daniel Cross. She may have threatened to expose him. And somewhere between that discovery and the telephone call at 2:17 a.m., something went terribly wrong. The investigation was no longer simply about a woman who disappeared. It was about what she knew, what she had threatened to reveal, and what someone was willing to do to keep that secret buried. But there was still one problem. The investigators needed to know what happened after Laura left the house. They needed to know where she went. And they needed to know whether she had ever reached the construction property alive. That answer would eventually come from a piece of evidence nobody had listened to for nearly 3 decades. A cassette tape. 6 seconds of sound. A man's breathing. A woman's voice. And 4 words that would send the entire case in a completely different direction. Please don't do this. The tape had been sitting in an evidence room since 2011. Nobody realized what it contained. Not until modern technology gave investigators a way to separate the noise from the voice. Not until someone turned up the volume. Not until the silence of 1998 finally began to speak. The cassette tape had been sitting in an evidence locker for 15 years. Nobody remembered who had placed it there. Nobody remembered why. The label was almost unreadable. Only a date remained visible. August 1998. And beneath it, written in black marker, were 3 words. Recovered near road. For years, the tape had been treated like everything else connected to Laura Bennett's disappearance. Old evidence. Possibly contaminated. Probably useless. Then, in 2024, a forensic audio specialist named Rachel Morgan was asked to examine it. She had worked on dozens of recordings recovered from old investigations. Damaged tapes. Broken answering machines. Police interviews. Home videos. Most contained nothing important. She expected the same from Laura's tape. She was wrong. The first playback produced almost nothing. Static. Wind. A faint electrical hum. Then a low mechanical sound. Rachel stopped the recording.
She rewound it.
Played it again. The sound was still there. Metal. A repeated clicking. Not random noise. Something mechanical. She increased the frequency range. The sound became clearer.
Click. Click. Pause. Click.
It sounded like a hydraulic mechanism opening and closing. Then came footsteps.
Slow.
Uneven. A vehicle door slammed. The tape continued. For several seconds, there was only wind. Then a man's breathing, close to the microphone. And finally, a woman's voice. Quiet. Shaking. Please don't do this. Rachel froze. She listened again. The voice was faint, but it was human. And it sounded terrified. She isolated the frequencies around the voice, removed background noise, adjusted the speed. Then she heard something else. A man speaking. The words were distorted, but one sentence could be reconstructed. Your mother will think you left. Rachel immediately contacted the lead investigator. The tape was no longer just evidence. It was a potential recording of the final moments of Laura Bennett's life. The question was whether the woman on the tape was actually Laura. Elaine Bennett was brought into the laboratory. She was nearly 80 years old. She walked slowly. She carried a photograph of her daughter. The technicians played the recording. Elaine listened without moving. When Laura's voice came through the speakers, Elaine closed her eyes.
She did not ask them to stop.
She listened until the tape ended. Then she whispered 2 words. That is Laura. The laboratory could not treat a mother's identification as scientific proof. But it mattered. Experts conducted voice comparisons using old recordings of Laura. A birthday video. A workplace training tape. A family recording from Christmas 1997. The voice characteristics were consistent. Not perfect. Not enough to establish absolute certainty, but strong enough to support the identification. Investigators now believe the tape contained Laura's voice shortly before her death. The next question was more disturbing. Where had it been recorded? The background noise became the key. The mechanical clicking was compared with equipment known to exist in Bellwether in 1998. Investigators discovered that the hydraulic gate at the old construction supply yard produced an almost identical sound. The gate had been installed in 1996. It was operated manually from a control box. Every opening produced 3 distinct clicks. The same pattern. 3 clicks.
Pause.
3 clicks. The tape contained it repeatedly. The location was no longer just a theory. It was a possibility. Investigators returned to the old property. The construction yard had changed dramatically. The original buildings were gone. The storage sheds had been demolished. The rear gate had been replaced. But underneath the new asphalt, the old access road remained. Using archived property maps, investigators reconstructed the site exactly as it had looked in 1998. The location of the gate, the storage yard, the service road, the drainage ditch, and an abandoned concrete mixing area. The geography suddenly made sense. If Laura had been taken from her home, someone could have driven her through the rear access road without passing the main highway.
No witnesses. No street lights.
No houses nearby. In 1998, the area was almost completely isolated. The perfect place to hide something. Or someone. Investigators searched old employee records. Daniel Cross had access to the property. More importantly, he had access after hours. He had a key to the rear gate. He had equipment stored there. And according to company records, he had used the property on the night Laura disappeared. But the records contained another problem. Cross had never mentioned going there. Not in 1998. Not in 2004. Not during the 2008 interview. Not even when investigators questioned him again in 2016. Every time, he said he had been working at a different location. The contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Investigators searched for more evidence. They found an old employee named Samuel Ortiz. Ortiz had worked for Cross in 1998. He had never been interviewed during the original investigation. He had moved away from Bellwether shortly after Laura disappeared. When detectives found him, he was living in Arizona. He initially remembered very little. Then investigators showed him a photograph of the construction yard. Ortiz stared at it. "That gate," he said. "What about it?" "I remember Cross was there that night." The investigators leaned forward. Ortiz explained that he had gone to the yard shortly after midnight to retrieve equipment. He saw Cross's sedan near the rear entrance. Cross was alone. At least, Ortiz thought he was alone. He remembered another detail. The passenger door was open. He could not see inside. He did not see Laura. He did not hear her voice. He did not know what was happening. At the time, he assumed Cross was moving equipment. Ortiz had no reason to suspect murder. But there was one thing he remembered clearly. Cross told him to leave. Immediately. Ortiz said Cross sounded angry. Not frightened. Angry. He drove away. 2 hours later, Laura disappeared. The timeline was suddenly tighter. Laura was seen at the diner around 10:15 p.m. The construction site closed at 11:30. Cross's vehicle was seen near the rear gate shortly after midnight. The telephone call came at 2:17 a.m. And the tape appeared to contain Laura's voice near machinery consistent with the construction yard. The evidence was beginning to form a timeline. But investigators still lacked the most important piece. What happened to Laura after the recording? The answer came from a financial record. In 1998, Cross had paid a local company for several loads of concrete fill. The order was unusual. The amount was far greater than what the company normally needed. The delivery occurred 3 days after Laura disappeared. The destination? The abandoned mixing area behind the construction yard. Investigators obtained the original invoice. 27 cubic yards of fill material. Delivered between September 2nd and September 4th. The dates were only days after Laura's disappearance. That raised an obvious question. Why? The company had no active construction project there. No building was being erected. No foundation was being poured. The material had been used to fill an old concrete mixing pit. Investigators searched aerial photographs. In photographs taken before Laura disappeared, the pit was visible. In photographs taken later that year, it was gone. Filled. Covered. Forgotten. The investigators stared at the images. The pit was approximately 3 meters deep. Large enough to conceal evidence. Large enough to hide a body. The location was secured. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. The first scan showed disturbed soil. Then another. A rectangular anomaly appeared beneath the surface. Investigators marked the coordinates. But they did not excavate immediately. They needed a warrant. They needed to establish probable cause. They needed to connect the location directly to Laura. The prosecutor's office reviewed the evidence. The bracelet. The DNA. The footprint. The vehicle. The telephone call. The tape. The financial records. The construction property. The false alibi. The witness statement. And now the disturbed soil. The case that had once contained almost nothing now contained too much. The search warrant was approved. Investigators arrived before sunrise. News helicopters began circling by mid-morning. Bellwether woke to flashing lights. People stood behind police barricades. Some had known Laura. Others had only heard her name. But everyone understood what the machines were searching for. The ground. 28 years of ground. The excavation began slowly. Layer by layer. No one spoke much. The machinery dug into the earth. Dirt was removed. Screened. Examined. Bagged. Then the first object appeared. A small piece of blue fabric. Investigators stopped. The fabric was heavily deteriorated, but it had a distinctive weave. Elaine Bennett had preserved one of Laura's old jackets. The laboratory compared the fibers. The result was consistent. The blue fabric could have come from Laura's jacket. It was not enough by itself, but it was another piece. Then came a metal pendant. Elaine identified it immediately. Laura had worn it during her final year of college. She had given it to herself as a birthday present. It had been missing since the night Laura disappeared. Elaine began crying when investigators showed her the photograph. The excavation continued. A rusted flashlight. A broken plastic container. A fragment of shoe material. Then something else. A small metal box. Inside the box was a second cassette tape. The same type as the first. The investigators sent it to the laboratory. This time, the recording was clearer. The tape began with wind. Then footsteps. Then Laura. "Why are you doing this?" A man's voice answered. "You should have kept quiet." Laura began crying. There was a struggle. Something struck the ground. Then silence. The recording ended. Investigators listened again. And again. The man's voice was not perfectly clear, but the audio experts found a distinctive speech pattern. A slight hesitation before certain words. A low vocal frequency. A particular pronunciation of the word quiet. They compared it with recorded interviews of Daniel Cross. The result was not absolute identification, but the similarities were striking. Then came another sound. A vehicle engine. The laboratory compared the engine frequency with a 1998 Ford Taurus. The acoustic profile was consistent. Not conclusive, but consistent. The prosecution now had a reconstructed sequence. Laura had discovered something involving Cross. She had confronted him. He had contacted her. She had ended up at the construction property. A confrontation had been recorded. She had been killed. Her body had been concealed. The evidence had been buried. And Cross had spent nearly 3 decades living with the assumption that the ground would keep his secret. But there was still one question. Why had the tape survived? Why had someone buried it instead of destroying it? Investigators believed the answer might be accidental. The tape could have been left inside the toolbox. The toolbox could have been moved. The soil could have shifted. A storm could have exposed the box years later. The chain of events was impossible to reconstruct with certainty. But one fact was becoming undeniable. Someone had tried to hide evidence. And the evidence had survived. The investigators now had enough to confront Daniel Cross one final time. He was 72 years old. He had lived 28 years without being charged. He had built a new life. He had grandchildren. He had property. He had a reputation. And he had one version of the past. But detectives now had another. They arranged the evidence across a table. The photograph of the muddy footprint. The bracelet. The DNA report. The photograph of the dark sedan. The old construction records. The concrete invoices. The audio transcripts. The forensic report. And finally, the photograph of the excavation site. The detective slid the final photograph across the table.
Cross looked at it.
For the first time, his expression changed. His eyes remained fixed on the image. The detective asked one question. "Where's Laura?" Cross said nothing. The detective asked again. "Where's Laura?" Still nothing. Then Cross looked up. His voice was almost a whisper.
You found her. The room went silent. It was not a confession. Not yet. But it was the first time Daniel Cross had acknowledged something investigators had spent 28 years trying to prove. Laura Bennett had never left Bellwether. She had never driven away. She had never started a new life. She had been there all along, buried beneath the town's memory, buried beneath the soil, buried beneath a lie that had survived longer than anyone expected. And now, with the evidence laid out in front of him, Daniel Cross understood what the investigators already knew. The past was no longer buried. The question was no longer whether Laura Bennett had been murdered. The question was whether the man sitting across from them would finally admit what he had done. Outside, reporters were already waiting. Inside, the recorder continued running. And after 28 years of silence, Daniel Cross was about to speak. Daniel Cross sat beneath the fluorescent lights and stared at the photograph in front of him. For nearly 3 decades, he had managed to keep one version of the story alive. Laura Bennett had disappeared. He had known her. They had dated. He had argued with her. But he had not seen her that night. That was the story he had told police in 1998. It was the story he had repeated years later. It was the story he had carried through marriages, business deals, birthdays, funerals, and every ordinary morning that followed. But now the investigators had something different. They had Laura's bracelet. They had Cross's DNA. They had the old photograph of his dark sedan. They had the boot print. They had the construction records. They had the concrete invoices. They had the buried evidence. And they had the tapes. The detective sitting across from him pressed the play button. The room filled with static. Then wind. Then footsteps. Then Laura's voice. "Why are you doing this?" Cross looked down. The recording continued. A man's voice. "You should have kept quiet," Laura cried. Something struck the ground. Then silence. The tape stopped. Nobody spoke. The detective waited. Cross's jaw tightened. "That's not me," he finally said. The detective did not answer. He placed another document on the table. The forensic audio report. The voice was consistent with Cross. The engine was consistent with his vehicle. The background machinery was consistent with the hydraulic gate at the construction yard. The timing placed the recording within hours of Laura's disappearance. Cross looked at the report. Then at the detective. "You've got a lot of guesses," he said. The detective leaned forward. "No. We have 28 years of evidence." Cross remained silent. The detective slid the photograph of the concrete pit across the table. "You filled this pit 3 days after Laura disappeared."
Cross shook his head.
"It was a construction job." "There was no construction project." "I don't remember." "You ordered 27 cubic yards of fill." "I don't remember." "You had access to the property." "So did other employees." "Your vehicle was there that night." "You can't prove I was driving it." "Your DNA was found on Laura's bracelet." Cross stared at him. "That doesn't prove murder." "No," the detective said, "but it proves you touched something that belonged to her." Cross leaned back. His expression hardened. For the first time, the polite image of the quiet contractor began to disappear. The detective knew that change mattered. But he also knew the law. A suspect could lie. A suspect could refuse to answer. A suspect could deny everything. The investigators needed more than emotion. They needed the truth. And the truth was buried somewhere between 2:17 in the morning and sunrise. The interview continued for nearly 3 hours. Cross denied knowing about the tape. Denied being at the construction yard. Denied ordering the concrete. Denied knowing where the bracelet came from. Then investigators asked about Laura's work at the credit union. Cross became silent. They asked whether Laura had ever confronted him about financial records. No answer. They asked whether she had threatened to report him. No answer. They asked whether he had ever told Laura to keep quiet. Cross looked toward the wall. Still nothing. Then the detective placed one final document on the table. A handwritten note. Laura's note. If anything happens, check the Cross file. Cross read it.
His face changed.
Not dramatically. Just enough. The detective saw it. You knew she was looking into you.
Cross shook his head. No.
You knew.
No.
You knew she had found something. Cross's eyes remained fixed on the note. Then he said something that investigators had never heard before. She didn't understand what she was looking at. The room went silent. The detective immediately stopped him. What was she looking at? Cross realized what he had said. He closed his mouth. For 28 years, investigators had tried to determine whether Laura had discovered financial fraud. Now Cross had confirmed something. He knew. He knew what she had discovered. And he knew she had been investigating him. The interview was over shortly afterward. Cross was not released. He was taken to a holding facility while prosecutors prepared the case. The news broke before noon. Man arrested in 1998 Texas cold case. Then the second headline appeared. DNA, audio tape, buried evidence links suspect to missing woman. Bellwether exploded. People gathered outside the courthouse. Former classmates of Laura arrived. Old neighbors arrived. Some carried photographs. Some carried flowers. Others simply stood in silence. For 28 years, the town had lived with uncertainty. Now uncertainty had a name. Daniel Cross. But the arrest was only the beginning. The prosecution still had to prove what happened. Cross's attorney immediately attacked the evidence. He called the case reconstruction built on fragments. He argued that the DNA on the bracelet could have come from years of innocent contact. He argued that the audio recording could not conclusively identify Cross. He argued that the boot print was inconclusive. He argued that the vehicle description was unreliable. And he argued that memories from 1998 could not be trusted. The defense had one central message. The evidence was suspicious. But suspicious was not the same as guilty. The prosecutors knew that. They needed a story that connected every fragment. So they rebuilt the final night of Laura Bennett's life. At 10:15 p.m., Laura was seen at the Bellwether Diner. She was nervous. She kept looking toward the parking lot. At approximately 11:30, the construction site officially closed. Cross had no reason to remain there. At some point after midnight, his dark sedan was seen near the rear gate. The gate opened. The machinery produced the same clicking sound later recovered on the tape. At 2:17 a.m., someone called Laura's house from a pay phone near the construction yard. Laura answered. 19 seconds later, the call ended. At some point after that, Laura left her house. Her keys remained behind. Her car remained behind. Someone had taken her. The bracelet was later found 2 miles away. Cross's DNA was on it. Then Laura's voice appeared on the tape. Then evidence connected the tape to the construction property. 3 days later, Cross ordered concrete fill. The pit disappeared. 28 years later, Laura's remains were recovered beneath it. The timeline was devastating. But the defense found a weakness. There was no direct evidence showing how Laura got from her house to the construction yard. No witness saw Cross force her into the vehicle. No surveillance cameras existed in Bellwether in 1998. No phone GPS. No digital records. No modern technology to trace movement. The prosecution's answer was simple. They did not need to prove every second. They needed to prove the chain. And the chain began with Laura's own home. Investigators revisited the house. The original structure was gone. But archived photographs showed the layout. The bedroom window. The back door. The kitchen. The position of the telephone. The muddy footprint. Forensic experts studied the old photographs again. This time, they noticed something else. The footprint was not the only impression near the door. There was a second partial mark. Smaller. Possibly from another boot. But the important detail was the direction. Both impressions pointed inward. Someone had entered. Not left. The investigators believed the person wearing the size 11 boots had approached the back door. The second person may have followed. Or Laura may have been forced inside. The evidence could not tell them everything. But it suggested movement. And movement meant the scene had not been random. Someone had come to Laura. Someone she may have known. Someone she may have trusted enough to answer the door. That possibility became central to the prosecution. Laura had not necessarily been dragged from her bedroom. She may have opened the door. She may have recognized the person outside. And that person may have been Daniel Cross. The defense objected. The theory was speculation. The judge agreed that the prosecution could not present it as established fact. But the jury would hear the evidence. Then came another breakthrough. Investigators found a former telephone technician. His name was Harold Pike. Pike had been 38 years old in 1998. He repaired the pay phone near the construction yard. He remembered something from the night of August 20th. He had not witnessed the disappearance. But he remembered repairing the line earlier that week. The phone had been used frequently. And one customer had complained that the receiver was malfunctioning. Pike had checked the line. The problem was not the telephone. It was the cord. Someone had pulled it hard. The cord showed fresh damage. Pike remembered because he had written it down. The report was still stored in an old municipal archive. The date? August 20th, 1998. The day Laura disappeared. The repair was completed at 8:40 p.m. 6 hours before the mysterious call. That meant someone had been using the pay phone late that night. It did not prove who. But it strengthened the timeline. Then investigators found the final piece of the financial motive. The Cross Construction Company had been losing money. Several invoices had been falsified. Payments had been redirected through shell accounts. Laura had discovered the discrepancies. She had printed copies. Those copies were missing from the credit union. But one had survived. A photocopy. Stamped with Laura's employee identification number. The document showed payments to a supplier that did not exist. The account was controlled indirectly by Cross. He had been stealing money. Laura had discovered it. And she had planned to expose him. The prosecution believed that was why she died. Not because of a personal argument. Not because of jealousy. Because Laura had become a threat. Cross had believed that if Laura disappeared, the evidence would disappear with her. But he had made one mistake. He underestimated time. He believed time would destroy evidence. Instead, time preserved some of it. The bracelet. The tapes. The photographs. The records. The DNA. The soil. Even the memory of a man who had repaired a telephone line almost 30 years earlier. Every piece had waited. And now those pieces were sitting inside a courtroom. The trial began on a Monday morning. Elaine Bennett sat in the first row. She carried Laura's photograph. The courtroom was full. Journalists filled the back. Former investigators sat along the wall. People from Bellwether watched silently. When Daniel Cross entered, nobody spoke. He looked older than the man in the 1998 photographs. 72 years old. White hair. Slow movements. A face marked by decades. But when he looked toward Elaine, something changed. She did not look away. The judge called the court to order. The prosecutor stood. And after 28 years, the first words of the murder trial were spoken. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Laura Bennett did not disappear. The prosecutor paused. She was taken. Another pause. And someone spent 28 years trying to make sure nobody would ever find out where she went. Behind him, a screen displayed Laura's photograph. 23 years old. Smiling. Alive. The courtroom became completely silent. Then the prosecutor displayed another image. The construction pit. Then the bracelet. Then the DNA report. Then the old footprint. Then the dark sedan. Then the cassette tape. One by one. The pieces of a forgotten night. And as the first evidence was presented, Daniel Cross sat motionless. But outside the courthouse, something unexpected was happening. An old woman had placed flowers beside Laura's memorial. Then another person came. Then another. By sunset, dozens of bouquets covered the stone. The town had waited 28 years for an answer. Now it had one. But the trial would force Bellwether to hear every detail. Every lie. Every missing hour. Every piece of evidence. Every word Laura had spoken. And somewhere inside that courtroom, the final truth about the night of August 20th, 1998, was about to emerge. Not from a confession. Not from a dramatic revelation. But from the evidence itself. Because the ground had given Laura back. And once the dead could finally speak through what remained, the man who had spent 28 years hiding behind silence would have nowhere left to hide. The courtroom doors opened at 8:45 that morning. By 9 o'clock, every seat was occupied. Some people had driven for hours. Others had grown up in Bellwether and remembered Laura Bennett when she was still a teenager. They came carrying newspaper clippings, old photographs, memories, and questions they had been asking for 28 years. At the center of the courtroom sat Daniel Cross. He looked straight ahead. Beside him sat his attorney. Across the room sat Elaine Bennett. Between them was the empty space that had existed in her family since 1998. The prosecutor stood before the jury. Behind him, Laura's photograph remained on the screen. He did not begin with the murder. He began with the woman. Laura Bennett was 23 years old. The photograph changed. Laura at graduation. Laura at work. Laura with her mother. Laura smiling beside her younger brother. The prosecutor told the jury about her routine. Her job. Her habits. Her family. Her plans. Then he reached the night she disappeared. At 10:15 p.m., Laura was at the Bellwether Diner. At 2:17 a.m., someone called her home. By morning, she was gone. The prosecutor paused. She did not take her car. Another photograph appeared. The driveway. Laura's vehicle. Still parked outside. She did not take her purse. Another image. Her purse on the kitchen counter. She did not take her keys. A photograph of the kitchen. The keys were visible. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. She did not leave Bellwether by choice. The defense objected. The judge allowed the statement, but reminded the jury that the prosecution would have to prove it. The prosecutor nodded. Then he moved to the evidence. The first witness was the former waitress from the diner. Her name was Patricia Lane. She was 67 now. When she entered the courtroom, She looked smaller than she had in the photographs from 1998. She took the oath. Then she looked toward the defense table. Her eyes stopped on Daniel Cross. She recognized him. The prosecutor asked if she remembered Laura. Patricia nodded. She came in around 10:15. What did she order? Coffee. Was she alone? Yes. Did she seem upset? Patricia hesitated. Not upset. Then what? Nervous. The defense attorney stood. Objection. Speculation. The judge sustained the objection. The prosecutor changed the question. What did Laura do? She kept looking outside. How many times? I don't know. More than once. Yes. Did she speak to anyone? No. Did anyone approach her? I don't remember. The prosecutor asked whether Laura had received a telephone call. Patricia thought for a moment, then shook her head. No. The testimony established something simple. Laura was alive. She was nervous. And she appeared to be waiting for someone. The next witness was Roy Maddox, the truck driver. He described the dark sedan. He described the missing front plate. He described where the car had been parked. The defense challenged him immediately. You saw this vehicle in darkness? Yes. How long? Maybe 10 seconds. 28 years ago? Yes. And you expect this jury to trust that memory? Maddox looked toward the jury. I don't remember the make. The attorney raised an eyebrow. But you remember the front plate. I remember because it was unusual. The attorney pressed him. Could you be wrong? Maddox paused. Maybe. Could the car have had a plate? Maybe. Could you have confused it with another vehicle? Maybe. The attorney sat down. The testimony had been weakened. But the prosecutor knew the photograph would matter more than memory. The gas station image appeared on the screen. A dark sedan. No front plate. The same rear bumper damage as Cross's vehicle. The jury leaned forward. Then came the vehicle records. Cross had owned a dark Ford Taurus. The vehicle had been sold 6 months after Laura disappeared. The defense argued that thousands of people owned similar cars. The prosecutor agreed. That's true. Then he displayed the photograph. This photograph was taken 3 days before Laura disappeared. The defense attorney stared at it. The prosecutor continued. And this vehicle was registered to Daniel Cross. The courtroom became quiet. Cross did not react. Then came the former construction employee, Samuel Ortiz. He walked slowly to the witness stand. He had not spoken publicly about the case in decades. The prosecutor asked him about the night Laura disappeared. Ortiz remembered going to the construction yard after midnight. He remembered seeing Cross. He remembered the sedan. He remembered the rear gate. And he remembered Cross telling him to leave. Did he tell you why? No. Did he seem angry? Yes. Did you see anyone else? Ortiz paused. No. Did you see anything inside the car? The passenger door was open. What was inside? I couldn't see. Did you hear anything? Ortiz shook his head. No. The defense attorney attacked the memory. You didn't report this in 1998. No. You didn't report it in 2000. No. Or 2005. No. Or 2010. No. So this memory appeared after 28 years? Ortiz looked down.
I remembered it when they showed me the photograph. The attorney smiled slightly. Exactly. Ortiz's voice hardened. I didn't say I remembered everything. The attorney stopped. Ortiz continued. But I remember that car. The courtroom went silent. Then came the forensic evidence. The DNA analyst explained the bracelet. A partial male profile had been recovered from the clasp. The profile matched Daniel Cross. The defense suggested innocent contact. The analyst agreed it was possible. After all, Cross had dated Laura. He could have touched the bracelet months before her disappearance. The prosecutor asked one question. Was the bracelet recovered from Laura's home?
No.
Where was it found? 2 miles away. Was it recovered from a controlled environment?
No.
Was it exposed to weather? Yes. The prosecutor paused. Despite that, you still recovered a profile? Yes. That mattered. Time and exposure had destroyed much of the biological material. Yet enough remained. Enough to identify the person who had touched it. The prosecution moved to the audio tape. The courtroom lights dimmed. Rachel Morgan, the forensic audio specialist, took the stand. She explained the condition of the recording. The damaged tape. The background noise. The restoration process. Then she described the voice. A woman.
A man.
Mechanical sounds. The defense attorney questioned her credentials, then challenged the identification. Can you say with absolute certainty that the woman is Laura Bennett?
No.
Can you say with absolute certainty that the man is Daniel Cross?
No.
Then this recording proves nothing. Morgan looked toward the jury. It doesn't prove everything. The prosecutor asked another question. What does it establish? That the recording contains a female voice consistent with Laura Bennett and a male voice with characteristics consistent with Daniel Cross. And the background? Consistent with the construction property. Why? The hydraulic mechanism. Could that sound occur elsewhere? Possibly. But was the same mechanism documented at Cross's property? Yes. The tape was played. Static. Wind. Footsteps. Then Laura's voice. Why are you doing this? A man's voice. You should have kept quiet. The courtroom listened. Nobody moved. Elaine's hands tightened around Laura's photograph. The recording ended. The defense attorney did not immediately object. He looked toward Cross. Cross stared at the floor. Then the attorney stood. He told the jury that the tape was damaged.
Old.
Incomplete. And incapable of proving who was speaking. The argument was legally valid. The prosecution knew it. The case could not depend on the tape alone. That was why the next witness mattered. A financial investigator. She explained Laura's work at the credit union. She described the Cross file. Falsified invoices. Payments to non-existent suppliers. Money transferred through accounts connected to Cross. Laura had discovered irregularities. She had printed documents. She had flagged transactions. And then she had disappeared. The defense tried to separate the financial fraud from the murder. Did Laura ever directly accuse Daniel Cross of theft?
No.
Did she file a police report?
No.
Did she tell her mother? Not specifically. So, you don't know that Daniel Cross killed her because of these records? The investigator answered carefully. I can only testify to the records. The prosecutor then presented Laura's handwritten note. If anything happens, check the Cross file. Elaine looked down. The note had been found inside an old personnel folder. The handwriting was Laura's. That was confirmed. The defense argued the note was ambiguous. It did not say Cross had threatened her. It did not say she feared him. It did not say she expected to die. But it established something. Laura was concerned about Cross. And she believed the financial records mattered. Then came the concrete invoices. 27 cubic yards. Delivered days after Laura disappeared. The defense argued the concrete was part of a legitimate construction project. The prosecution showed aerial photographs. The pit had been filled. No construction project existed there. The defense called the evidence suspicious. The prosecution called it concealment. The jury would decide. Then the medical examiner entered the courtroom. The room changed. Until this moment, Laura had existed mainly as photographs, recordings, and memories. Now the jury would hear about the remains. The examiner described the recovery, the condition of the bones, the location, the injuries. There had been trauma to the skull. The injury was consistent with a heavy impact. The defense asked whether the injury could have happened after death. The medical examiner said it was possible, but the overall evidence suggested the trauma occurred before death. The prosecutor asked whether Laura's remains could have been placed in the pit shortly after she died. Yes. Could they have remained there for 28 years? Yes. Would the soil preserve certain evidence? Yes. The prosecutor asked one final question. Could you determine the exact date of death?
No.
The answer was honest. Science could not provide every answer, but it could eliminate some possibilities. Laura had not left Bellwether alive. She had died there. And someone had hidden her remains. The defense now had to explain the entire chain. Why was Cross's DNA on the bracelet? Why was his vehicle connected to the area? Why did the audio resemble his voice? Why was the construction property involved? Why was the pit filled after Laura disappeared? Why had Cross lied about his alibi? Why had he admitted knowing about the financial records? Why had he never mentioned being at the property? One coincidence could be explained.
Two could be challenged.
But the jury was staring at a mountain of them. And still, the prosecution had not finished. Because there was one witness who had been waiting nearly 3 decades to tell the story. Elaine Bennett. When she finally stood, the courtroom became completely silent. She carried no documents, no evidence, only a photograph of Laura. The prosecutor approached gently. Mrs. Bennett, do you remember the morning your daughter disappeared? Elaine looked at the jury. Yes. Tell them what you found. She took a breath. The door was unlocked.
She paused.
The kitchen light was on. Another pause. Her keys were on the counter. Her voice began to shake. And Laura was gone. The prosecutor asked what she did next. Elaine looked toward Daniel Cross. For the first time that morning, Cross looked directly at her. Elaine did not look away. I waited, she said. Every day. Her voice became quieter. For 28 years. Nobody in the courtroom moved. Then she looked down at Laura's photograph. And now I know where my daughter was. The prosecutor asked no further questions. He didn't need to. Elaine stepped away from the witness stand. As she passed Daniel Cross, she stopped for only a second.
She did not speak.
She simply looked at him. Then she walked back to her seat. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for a statement. Inside, the defense prepared its final witnesses. The prosecution had built its chain. But the trial was not over. Cross still had a defense. And his attorney had one last argument. The evidence might prove that Daniel Cross knew Laura.
It might prove he touched her bracelet. It might place his vehicle near the construction yard. It might show that he lied. But did it prove murder? The jury would have to decide. And, before they could decide, they would hear the most dangerous possibility of all. That Daniel Cross had not acted alone. Because investigators had found another DNA trace at the construction property. A second male profile. Unknown. Unidentified. And if that profile belonged to another person, then the story of Laura Bennett's final night was about to become even darker. The cold case had been solved enough to produce an arrest. But perhaps not enough to explain everything. And the question now hanging over Bellwether was no longer simply who killed Laura. It was this. Who else was there when she disappeared? The second DNA profile changed the courtroom. Until that moment, the prosecution had built its case around one man. Daniel Cross. One vehicle. One construction yard. One bracelet. One buried secret. But now there was another profile. Another unknown man. Another question. If someone else had been present when Laura Bennett disappeared, then the final hours of her life might have been very different from what investigators had imagined. The prosecutor did not reveal the discovery immediately. He waited until the forensic specialist took the stand. Dr. Rachel Morgan returned to the courtroom. She carried a thin evidence folder. The defense attorney recognized it. "What is in that folder?" he asked. Morgan looked toward the prosecutor. A brief pause. Then she answered. "An additional DNA profile." The courtroom stirred. The judge called for silence. The defense attorney approached the witness. "Additional?" "Yes." "From the same evidence?"
No.
"Where?" "From material recovered near the construction property." "Is it Daniel Cross?"
No.
"Is it Laura Bennett?"
No.
"Then who is it?" "We don't know." The attorney smiled. For the first time during the trial, the defense appeared confident. "You don't know who it belongs to?" "Correct." "So there is another unidentified man connected to the location?" "Yes." "And you have no evidence that my client is that man?" "Correct." The attorney turned toward the jury. The message was obvious. Another man existed. Another possibility existed. Another explanation existed. But the prosecutor remained calm. Because the second profile was not necessarily a weakness. It might be the missing piece. Investigators had found the DNA on a fragment of blue fabric recovered near the concrete pit. The fabric itself was consistent with Laura's jacket. The profile belonged to a male. But there was more. The sample had not been recovered from the deepest part of the pit. It had been found near the edge. That suggested contact with the fabric before or during concealment. The prosecutor asked Morgan another question. Was the second profile found on Laura's remains?
No.
Was it found inside the pit?
No.
Where was it found? Approximately 4 feet from the location where the remains were recovered. Could it have been deposited later? Yes. Could it have been present before the burial? Yes. The answer was frustratingly uncertain. Science could establish possibilities. It could not reconstruct every moment. The defense seized on that uncertainty. They argued that the second DNA profile created reasonable doubt. Perhaps another man had killed Laura. Perhaps Cross had nothing to do with the murder. Perhaps the bracelet had been touched months earlier. Perhaps the tapes had been contaminated. Perhaps the entire case had been built around a series of coincidences. But then the prosecutor asked Morgan one final question. Did the second DNA profile match any individual in the national database?
No.
Was it identified through genealogy? Yes. The defense attorney immediately objected. The judge allowed the testimony. Morgan continued. The profile produced a distant familial connection. To whom? She looked at the report. To the Cross family. The courtroom exploded into whispers. Daniel Cross suddenly lifted his head. His attorney turned toward him. The judge demanded silence. The second DNA profile did not belong to Daniel, but it appeared to belong to someone biologically related to him. A distant relative. Investigators began tracing the family tree. The connection eventually led to a name. Michael Cross. Daniel's younger half-brother. He had been 19 years old in 1998, and he had lived in Bellwether. He had worked occasionally for Daniel's construction company. Most importantly, he had access to the property. The investigators located Michael. He was alive. Living in another state. For nearly 30 years, he had never been publicly associated with Laura's disappearance. When detectives contacted him, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The result came back. The unknown profile was consistent with Michael Cross. The defense now had a new theory. Maybe Michael was responsible. Maybe Daniel had nothing to do with Laura's death. Maybe the investigators had arrested the wrong man. But Michael's own history complicated that argument. He admitted working for Daniel in 1998. He admitted visiting the construction yard. He admitted knowing Laura. And then he admitted something else. He had lied during the original investigation. When police asked him in 1998 whether he had seen Laura during the week of her disappearance, he said no. That statement had been buried in an old interview transcript. Now it was back. Investigators asked Michael why he had lied. His answer was simple. I was scared. Of what? My brother. The statement stunned investigators. Michael claimed Daniel had threatened him. He said Daniel told him to stay out of the investigation. He said Daniel warned him that if police discovered what had happened at the construction yard, both brothers would be ruined. But Michael refused to say that Daniel had killed Laura. Instead, he described something more complicated. According to Michael, Daniel had called him late on the night Laura disappeared. He told him to come to the construction yard. Michael arrived shortly after midnight. Daniel's sedan was already there. The rear gate was open. Michael said he saw Laura. Alive. She was standing near the storage building. Her hands were tied. Her face was bruised. She was crying. Michael said he froze. He asked Daniel what he had done. Daniel allegedly told him that Laura had discovered the financial records. She was going to report him. Michael wanted to leave. But Daniel threatened him. Then came the moment that Michael remembered most clearly. Laura looked directly at him. She said his name. Michael. He heard it once. Then again. Please help me. Michael claimed he did nothing. That confession changed the case. For 28 years, investigators had assumed there was one perpetrator. Now they had a witness who claimed to have been there. A witness whose DNA appeared at the scene. A witness who admitted lying. And a witness who claimed Daniel Cross was responsible. But Michael Cross was not innocent. If his story was true, he had witnessed Laura's final hours. He had failed to help her. He had helped keep the secret. And he had lied to investigators. The prosecution considered charging him. But there was a problem. Michael's account could not be independently verified. His DNA established presence. Not murder. His confession established knowledge. Not necessarily participation. And his memory could have been distorted by decades of guilt. The prosecutor needed to know whether Michael was telling the truth. So investigators asked him to describe the construction yard. Not generally. Specifically. Where was Laura standing? Where was Daniel? Where was the vehicle? Where was the tape? Where was the concrete pit? Michael answered every question. Then he described a small storage room. He said Laura had been held there briefly. Investigators checked old architectural plans. The room existed. He described a broken window on the north wall. The window existed. He described a red toolbox beneath the workbench. Investigators found photographs from 1998 showing the toolbox. He described the hydraulic gate. He knew exactly how it sounded. 3 clicks.
Pause.
3 clicks. The same sound captured on the tape. Then Michael gave investigators something they did not expect. He remembered a small drain behind the storage building. He said Daniel had washed something there. Investigators returned to the property. The drain was still there. They removed the old cover. Inside was a small fragment of metal. A broken clasp. The same type used on Laura's bracelet. Forensic testing found trace biological material. The material was too degraded for a complete DNA profile. But there was enough to establish that it had once contained biological material consistent with Laura. The case was becoming darker. Michael's story was beginning to align with physical evidence. But there was one detail he could not explain. Why had Laura's body been placed inside the concrete pit? Michael claimed he did not know. He said that after the confrontation, he left. He claimed Daniel remained with Laura. He never saw what happened afterward. That meant Michael might not have witnessed the killing. But he had witnessed the kidnapping. And that was enough to destroy Daniel's original alibi. The prosecution brought Michael into the courtroom. The gallery reacted immediately. Some people whispered. Others stared. Daniel Cross did not look at his brother. Michael took the oath. The prosecutor began. Were you at the construction property on the night Laura Bennett disappeared? Yes. Why did you lie about that in 1998? Michael swallowed. Because Daniel told me to. Did Daniel threaten you? Yes. What did he say? Michael looked toward his brother. Then he answered. He said if I talked, I'd disappear too. The defense objected. The judge allowed the statement for its relevance. The prosecutor continued. Did you see Laura Bennett that night? Yes. Was she alive? Yes. Was she injured? Yes. Who had control of her? Michael's eyes filled with tears. Daniel. The courtroom went completely silent. The defense attorney stood. You expect this jury to believe you now. Michael looked at him. I didn't expect anyone to believe me. Why wait 28 years? Because I was afraid. Afraid of Daniel? Yes. Daniel was 72 when arrested. Michael looked down. He wasn't 72 in 1998. The statement hung in the courtroom. The defense challenged every part of Michael's testimony. He had lied. He had concealed evidence. He had waited decades. He could have been trying to save himself. He could have invented details after seeing media reports. But prosecutors had something important. Michael knew things that had never been released publicly. He knew about the storage room, the broken window,
the drain,
the hydraulic gate, the red toolbox. Details buried inside evidence files. Some of them had never appeared in newspapers. That made his story harder to dismiss. Then Michael described the final conversation he remembered. Laura was crying. Daniel was angry. She told him she had copied financial records. She said she had sent some of them to someone outside Bellwether. Daniel asked who. Laura refused to answer. Daniel struck her. Michael said he turned away.
He heard a sound.
Then silence. When he looked back, Laura was on the ground.
Daniel told him she was dead.
Michael said he did not know whether that was true. He wanted to call police. Daniel stopped him. Then Daniel told him they had to make it look like Laura had left voluntarily. The keys remained inside the house. The car remained outside. The telephone call was used as part of the deception. The open window was staged. And later, the bracelet was taken away from the property and placed in the drainage ditch. The prosecution now had an explanation for the strange details that had confused investigators for decades. But there was still one missing piece. Michael had said Laura had copied financial records. Where were those records? Investigators searched the old construction property again.
They searched the storage building,
the storage room,
the drain,
the toolbox. Nothing. Then Michael remembered something. Laura had been carrying a small red envelope. He remembered seeing it on the floor. Daniel had taken it. He believed Daniel had destroyed it. But investigators had another possibility. What if he had not? They returned to Daniel's old property. A search warrant was issued. Inside an attic storage box, investigators found dozens of papers from the late 1990s. Tax documents, invoices, bank statements, old construction contracts. And beneath them, sealed inside a plastic envelope, were copies of financial records from the Bellwether County Credit Union. Laura's handwriting was visible on the margins. A note had been written across the top. If I disappear, this is why. The courtroom would not see that document until the following morning, because the discovery was too important to introduce without verification. And when forensic examiners tested the paper, they found something unexpected. A partial fingerprint.
Old.
Faded. But usable. The print belonged to Daniel Cross, the same man who had spent 28 years claiming he had nothing to do with Laura's disappearance. The same man who had denied knowing what she had discovered. The same man who had told investigators he had never seen her that night. Now his fingerprint was sitting on a document written by Laura. A document that appeared to explain why she believed she was in danger. The prosecution had built its case from fragments. Now those fragments were beginning to speak in the same voice. But the defense was not finished. And neither was Daniel Cross. Because when his attorney returned to the courtroom the next morning, he brought a new claim. He said Michael Cross had been the real killer. He said Daniel had been framed by his own brother. And he promised the jury that the defense would prove it. The courtroom filled again. Elaine Bennett sat in silence. Michael waited outside. Daniel Cross entered without looking at anyone. For the first time, the case had two brothers at its center. One accused. One witness. Both connected to Laura. And somewhere between their two stories was the truth. The jury was about to hear the final version of the night Laura Bennett disappeared. And this time, the evidence would have to decide which brother was lying.